Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Renu Tyagi from Department of Anthropology, University of Delhi. Today I am going to talk about the module Men, Nature and Culture, Nature Relationships from the paper Ecological Anthropology, Culture and Biological Dimensions. The learning objectives of the modules are: number 1, to furnish the idea about the interrelationship between men, nature and culture. Number 2 is to discuss about how emergence of different cultures of men is related to the nature. Number 3 is to diversify the knowledge about transition in human population with the dynamic advancement in technologies. And number 4 is to understand factors responsible for the transition and diversification of the societies. Human evolution can be better understood through an anthropological perspective, as it explains how, why and from where we have come to the stage where we are now. What are the key factors associated with the categorization of human into different race, culture, language, etc.? There is an interaction between human and nature that gave rise to different cultures, and this only became possible by humans' curious nature for survival. If we see it from the evolutionary perspective, what we know is that the early human ancestors were a bunch of nomadic people that relied on the hunting and gathering. It is assumed that they used the sign language, voice modulations as mode of communication, much more similar behavior that we see as common among the other primate groups today. The notion is not only about what made humans to bifurcate from the rest of the primate group and also how the bifurcation emerged. The interrelationship between the human culture and nature is a complex one, as one cannot conclusively say that one aspect is responsible for the development of change in the other two. In fact, the dynamic nature of the all three aspects are responsible for their change. For example, we cannot simply understand that humans can survive in extreme cold climate because of their adaptive physiology, but there is also the role of culture that comes into play. And in addition to that, there is always the nature that selects the fittest. The environmental determinism and possibilism always play the thematic role while understanding the relationship between man, culture and nature. Environmental determinism focused on the concept that environment determines all the aspects of human. According to environmental determinism, the personality and the intelligence level are somehow determined by the climate in the 18th century. Some of the scholars even try to relate the practice of religion based on the climate. For instance, the practice of Buddhism in India was explained on the basis of climate of the India, that is, it is the hot climate which makes the body lethargic, and so people tend to follow the passive religion, according to Hudstein 1977. However, this thought was overruled by the environmental possibilism, which made significant contribution to the cultural area concept. It explained that culture is patterned by the environment, but it did not cause it. It became more necessary to have deeper understanding of the relationship among man, culture and the nature. We shall now look into the historical perspective of the evolution of relationship among man, nature and culture. Figure 1 displays the interaction relationship between man, nature and culture. It is known fact that every human society at some point of time was once hunter and gatherers. Until about 10,000 years ago, all people practiced hunting and gathering economy. In fact, we still rely on the hunting and gathering, but the only difference is that the mode of access is more advanced and sophisticated. The change in the climate strategies applied by the humans to overcome different barriers for survival Cognitive development, which led to the advancement in the technology, etc., have made possible to acquire a lifestyle where we don't have to go out into the woods or forest every day, risking our lives looking for food like our forefathers did. The emergence of the agriculture can be marked as a paradigm shift for the nature, culture and human. Lives changed, different culture emerged and nature is exploited. The evolution of the interrelationship between man, culture and nature has been briefly described under different subheadings in the further module. These are categorized on the basis of different era human once lived and how the transition from one era to another caused the change in culture and the nature. Let's understand first the hunter and gatherer era. The culture of the past, the hunter-gatherer era lived by our ancestors, is also termed as the Paleolithic era and is divided into three phases as the upper, middle and the lower Paleolithic era. The three categorization of the era is particularly on the basis of the difference in the tools they used. They lived in egalitarian societies, had less possessions, the only economy was hunting and gathering and their lifestyle were nomadic. Cases of the disease were seen less. They lived in a band that consisted of 20 to 50 members. Since they have to move from one place to another and they did not have anything to store their food resources, they never exploited the nature by hunting and gathering more than their want. As such, hunting and gathering was practiced on a daily basis. The only material culture they possessed were the crude tools made from the stones and the wood used for their hunting and gathering purposes and which later were modified based on their needs. They had a close contact with the nature and believed that nature would always provide them with abundant food resources, which was not the case. Success in finding a game started to decrease. The change in the climate started to make the food resources very scarce and they followed the reciprocity made them to use the strategy of fission and fusion. At the time of the scarcity of food, the band split into smaller groups consisting of fewer members in a group, and the time of the abundance of the food, the group reunited. Life as hunter and gatherers started to fail. Just at the end of the Paleolithic era, accidentally or intentionally done, but there was seen the emergence of the agriculture. Though it took time to spread all over and the transition from nomadic to sedentary lifestyle took a long period of time, according to Sutton and Anderson in a study done in 2004. Agriculture as a paradigm shift in culture and nature can be understood. Early hunting and the gathering societies moved from one place to another in search of the food. They owned simple tools for hunting and gathering. Along with the threats of the nature, emerged agriculture as the mode of subsistence living, which resulted in lives becoming more sedentary. With the development in tools, agriculture started to flourish at a wide range. This era is termed as the Neolithic era. People started to build the houses instead of living in the caves that led to the culture of living in a house. The evidences of the different kind of houses where our ancestors lived draw our attention to the fact that different houses were built according to the climatic conditions and the environment they lived in. Different tools used in agriculture fields were also recovered from the sites where the human practiced agriculture. This also adds to our knowledge that development in technology has contributed a lot in human development in many areas. People started growing their own food. They started to settle near their agricultural areas, mostly near the places where the accessibility of the water was not a problem. Agricultural land were of most prized possession for them. They started to domesticate animals. Life seems to become stable, but all this was at the expense of the health issues, social disparity, etc. that changed the course of culture and the nature. Earlier diseases were not so common like it was now when humans started to come in close contact with the animal. With their growing population, the need for food also grew, which led them clear more forest and to make it suitable for the agriculture. This act disturbed the ecosystem and the natural environment of the organism living in and around the cleared forest. People suffered from the illness. Many died as the medical facilities were not good and the illness was treated as a bad omen. Some flourishes in agriculture and possess more food and land that made others dependent upon them. Nature, which was considered as giving nature, now became only a mode from where they can draw many resources. Alongside agriculture, pastoralism also flourished in the places where agriculture was not suitable. People owned large number of cattle. It is also a form of economic activity as the pastoralists exchanged their basic needs along with the cattle products. Unlike agriculturists that practiced the sedentary lifestyle, pastoralists were nomadic people who wandered from one place to another place suitable for cattle grazing, and unlike hunter and gatherers who valued the dead animal as was the only source of food other than the root, leaf and nuts. For pastoralists, their cattle are valuable only when alive. They even engaged themselves in quarrel with other groups of the people just to protect their cattle. This can also be seen as the different culture being practiced differently based on the different environment and situations. Every practice of culture somehow relates to the nature and environment. Hunter and gatherers were nomadic people who valued meat. Agriculturists were sedentary but relied mostly on the agricultural product, and pastoralists protected their cattle but were nomadic. Now let us see the transition of economy with the change in culture. It is said that resources are limited and human wants are unlimited. The growing need of the human has played an important role in the cognitive development that in long run has given rise to the development in technologies which are applied for survival. Technology is the toolkit used by humans in the quest of food, shelter and reproduction. The rise in different technologies pioneered the emergence in the different kind of material culture, like the invention of different kind of potteries, ceramic wares, ornaments, structure of the houses. Introduction of the coins and money. People advanced in technologies, started to yield the good harvest and rule over the ones who fails in yielding the high amount. Disparity in the societies emerged. Reciprocity is the only form of economy practiced by the hunter and gatherers, was dominated by the barter system, where one good is exchanged with another, which later transformed into monetary system. Barter system gave rise to an economy that consisted of the debts and slavery. The introduction of the metals was followed by the concept of money. The more there is transition in culture and the more complex a society and its culture gets. Figure 2 shows the relationship between nature, culture and human being. Let's understand the complex relationship between man and nature. From biological perspective, to survive and continue the progeny, every organism needs food, shelter and protection. Humans have always excelled as compared to other beings because of their adaptive characteristics, which takes place at behavioral, cultural, genetic level. Genetic demographics as well as the physiological or biological level. These responses for adaptation takes place to adjust with the different environments. Rapid adjustment to sudden change in the environment takes place at behavioral level. For example, standing on a shade to stay away from the hot sun, to sit near the fireplace when there is cold weather. It is when the behavioral response fails to adjust with the sudden environment changes, the role of biological adaptation comes into play. For example, if even after getting near a fireplace one feels cold, then to adjust with the environment and maintain the homeostasis, one starts shivering, which increases the metabolic rate, and peripheral blood vessels constrict to conserve the heat. As compared to the behavioral adaptation, physiological responses are not as fast. If the physiological changes continues for a longer period of time, genetic responses start to occur. For example, living in a cold environment for a longer duration can bring about permanent changes like enlargement of the lungs. But this change in genetic structures takes many generations. From the bioculture perspective, the interplay between biological and cultural variables with respect to the nature is to be looked from the historical and or ecological perspective. For example, the relationship between sickle cell anemia and culture in West Africa is linked with the agriculture and the spread of malaria. According to Livingstone, it is observed that the spread of sickling gene is greatly enhanced by the development of agriculture. The clearing of the forest for cultivation provides a breeding ground for the mosquito, which is the vector of Plasmodium falciparum malaria. It is found that the individual who are the carrier or heterozygotes of the sickling gene have a higher immune system against malarial infection when compared with either the normal person without the gene or with those person who are homozygous for the gene. There is clear evidence that the frequency of sickling gene is low in hunting and gathering population as compared to those population which are more dependent on the agriculture. This indicates that the spread of the sickling gene is associated with the spread of agriculture because the gene provides a superior fitness to the heterozygous individual. This is what is known as the selective advantage of the heterozygotes. It provides a good example of the interplay between biological and cultural adaptation of human population to the environment. Another example can be taken of a condition termed as hypervitaminosis, a condition with an excess of vitamin A due to consumption of the livers and fats of the marine and aquatic animal is reported to be responsible for the aberrant behavior known as bibloctalk among Eskimo people. Such aberrant behavior could also be linked with the socio-economic condition which may be associated with the other biological factors. People living in the colder region do not have other options rather than to consume the sea animals and animals with the fat. Taking the biological perspective into consideration, fat is essential for people living in the colder region for better metabolism. In the other way round, only those kind of foods rich in fat are available within their environment, and consumption of the excess amount of the fat can lead to the hypervitaminosis. This condition can also be seen as the interaction between biology and culture, how human biology have adapted in certain environment of the nature practicing certain culture, or how nature has led humans to adapt certain culture that was made the human biology gets accustomed to its environment. Now let us understand the relationship between culture and nature. Human culture is very diverse and cannot be defined taking into consideration one culture alone. Different people have different interpretation about their culture and other culture. So one can assume that culture is anything related to men which is not biological or innate, like food, clothing, lifestyle, tradition, custom, language, marriage patterns, housing structures. Almost everything is culture. We cannot judge one culture based on their food habits or clothing, as there might be some reasons behind those practices. For example, the Inuits of the Arctic have realized effective cultural adaptation to cold stress in terms of clothing and shelter. They wear the layered clothing, trapping air between the layers to act as an insulator. They also construct temporary shelters and use snow as an excellent insulator. Permanent housing use underground entrances and higher living areas. Because their body requires more heat to maintain the homeostasis and proper metabolism, they eat food rich in fat, and other body also have adapted to digesting more fat. Likewise, population in dry and the hot environments have realized effective cultural adaptation to the heat stress using clothing and shelter designed to reduce the heat production, reduce heat gain from radiation and conduction, and increase the evaporation. Typical clothing for people living in the dry and hot environment is light and loose. Shelters are frequently built compactly. Light colors reflect the sun, and doors and windows are kept closed during the day. Consumption of the food rich in water is also seen among the people living in hot regions. All these activities comes under culture which every population have adapted in order to survive in their environment. Our earth houses many number of people and they live in different regions. Some live in cold, some in hot, some in high altitude, and with the spinning wheel of the time, every population have learned how to live in their environment, and that in the long run has become their culture. Culture that identified them brings about a group of people under one culture. Like the human biology holds a characteristics called adaptation, similarly culture is also adaptive in nature. The different advanced technologies used at the area of agriculture can also be seen as culture, practice for the better and faster yield of the crops to increase the possibilities of gaining profit. Material culture and the technology were believed to be the most affected by the environment. It is not just the human capacities and cultural heritage determines the material culture, but it is the environment that holds the key. People with skills are of less importance if the environment does not provide them with the material to use their skills on. Figure 3 depicts the culture and nature in cold climate. Culture and nature in hot region is presented in figure 4. There is an interplay between nature and culture, and it has always been a complex one to determine. It is hard to define the relationship between culture and nature, as one cannot conclusively define the past based on assumption, and the interlinkage between culture and nature can be predicted to be as old as human existence. All culture are in fact the outcome of the various phases of the nature. In every culture of the past, the act of nature is depicted. Our ancestors considered nature as giver and considered themselves as nature's children. Till today, in many cultures, mostly among the tribes, nature holds an important place. Nature has always been considered superior to all in all cultures. Different cultures have different interpretation of the nature. In many societies, rituals based on the sacrificial offerings to nature are conducted before and after the harvest. In many cultures, any illness is treated as bad omen of the nature, and again rituals are performed to make the mother nature play smooth. Many cultures perform rituals before consuming anything provided by nature. In any culture, nature has always been considered as a superior force that has power to give as well as take. Man and culture plays as friend as well as foe. Human culture and nature are the entities which are tied by the same rope, and every act from one end somehow affects all. In one hand, culture is the act of humans, particularly the act adapted to survive the threats of the nature, and the other hand, human culture seems to play hard on the nature which is hampering the survival. It is to be understood that the act for the survival should not be at the expense of causing threat to the nature. As a matter of fact, that the act in long run can hamper the human survival. If we trace down the history, the hunting and gathering societies solely relied on the nature, yet they did not exploit the nature until human culture evolved. The emergence of the agriculture marks a transition from taking what is required for survival to exploiting nature for gaining more. The evolution of the simple societies to more sophisticated ones, the growing need of the growing population, advancement in the technologies and globalization of the economy, every aspect of men for better survival tend to rely on keeping nature at stake. The lack of awareness about nature is leading to global warming and climate change. The excess use of resources in the form of fossil fuel can result in extinction and scarcity of these resources for our future generations. Though some initiatives are being taken to protect the nature, but the growing developmental assignment are at much higher pace and in the greater deal. The module can be summarized as the relationship between men, culture and nature has many interpretations, as it can be seen as the wheels of a cart that goes hand in hand. Many theories have emerged so far that has tried to explain the unresolved mystery about the emergence of the culture, whether it is an accidental act or an act based on the nature. Well, the answer lies in what an individual wants to believe in. The idea of environmental determinism and possibilism throws some light on what may be the cause of cultural emergence and evolution. Looking back to the history, our forefathers seem to have lived as hunter and gatherers, wandering into the wilderness in search of food and the shelter. The introduction of the agriculture marks an important transition of culture and the relationship of man with nature. The lifestyle became more sedentary. The idea of storing the resources for future emerged that led to the invention of the material culture, like potteries. Different tool technologies emerged, social hierarchies started to develop. With the close contact with the animals, they had started to domesticate animals, which led to the emergence of various types of diseases. If we look through the biological perspective, the relationship between man and the nature, adaptation tend to play a vital role. Humans have been gifted with the quality to adapt to the changing course of nature. So, if the body is exposed to specific environment, it tends to acclimatize, and in the long run, some genetic changes can possibly occur which makes them more suitable to survive than other people who are alien to that environment. The biocultural perspective, on the one hand, makes the relationship between man and culture and nature more elaborative. It is the cultural practices that lead to the change in human biology. The cultural practices are again linked with the environment possibilism. The areas where agriculture is possible, people tend to suffer from the diseases, but some diseases have caused mutation in the human genes which have made them to resist from the diseases. Example can be of sickle cell anemia. Culture and nature have always played a vital role in human survival. People have adapted culture to survive, and the threat of the nature or the nature was led them to adapt the cultures. Hard to explain. Different people of the different areas have different cultures which possibly would have emerged to adapt to that environment. Man and nature always lived together, and the balance was always maintained, not until human wants grew rapidly that brought about much advancement in the technologies to exploit nature and have more. Culture was for survival, and now the strategies for survival is deteriorating nature. The relationship between the three, that is man, culture and nature, only tends to get broad if different perspectives are taken into consideration. But the idea is the relationship is a complex one, and men should not underestimate the nature and try to break the bond. The focus should be more on how to mold culture in such a way that the relationship with the nature can be made a healthier one. Thank you.